Welcome to Norse Talk, Information of the Gods, guys. Tonight we are going through the third chapter in A Practical Heathen's Guide to the Asatru by Patricia M. Lafayllve. So this is our third episode on this chapter, going over the gods. This has been a very exciting chapter. I'm so ready to get into it. I am the Red Bearded Viking. This is Red Dranger, and how are you doing tonight, brother?
I'm doing really well, man. I am super excited for this episode. I had so much fun on the altar building night, and I've been super stoked to get back into this chapter because this is the literal chapter that everybody here is going to have some sort of interest in. There, everybody has a deity, everybody has something they're looking for, and hopefully this can help. So I'm super excited. Like we said, guys, today we're going to be finishing up chapter 3. Last time we finished off with Tyr, so today we will be starting with Hulda. I do want to mention that there are a couple of deities in this next couple of pages where they are going to be mentioning and referencing some stuff that we have not gone over yet. When we do get to those names and terms, I am going to try to quickly explain them to you. And it led to some really cool questions in my mind today that I wrote down, so it should be a lot of fun. So, Randy, we ended with Tyr last week.
Right. So we're going to
We're moving.
start tonight, you guys, with Hulda.
Yeah.
Which she was best known among the Germanic source materials because of the fact that she governs in the act of spinning,
Yeah.
which keeps order in the hall and rides the wild hunt with Odin. So she's also one of Odin's that rides with him as well.
Yeah.
And they do
I think,
claim some. Oh, sorry. They do claim some similarities to Frigga with her, and they do mention that some scholars, not all, but some, do think that the two are one and the same. But it's unlikely, given that Hulda has such a prominent place in the modern generic folklore.
I didn't know much about Hulda, but I did find it really interesting that she's on the wild hunt with Odin, which does kind of give her that credit as a death god. And leading into the rake and brooms, and when it gets to talking about the caretaker for the souls of children, there's a little bit of back and forth between Christianity's aspect on that and the paganistic aspect on that, where she was the keeper of souls. She collected the souls of children. And when I first read that, it came across kind of negative to me, like, well, why is a deity doing this? But as I read on, it kind of made more sense that she was doing it to protect them. She was a protector of children, which was really interesting because when you get into the different halls and the different realms from when people pass, I'd never really given much thought to children before. So it was interesting to kind of have an answer to that finally.
Right, because it's like, normally when people are talking about the Norse history and the Norse mythology, paganism, heathenism, Austruism, all of that, when they're talking about when people die, they're usually talking about people going to Valhalla or one of the other halls, because they're thinking of the aspect of what they achieved in their life as adults and stuff, and they're up until now, this is really the first mention I've ever even heard of the children.
Yeah.
But one thing I did like in the analogy in the book was with the rake and the broom, because it's like when the rake comes through, because the rake has holes in between each time, it doesn't take all the people. But if everyone died, then it was because she swept them with the broom instead, and there was no holes for anybody to get through. I love how they put that analogy in there.
Yeah,
and it gives you a good visualization.
Yeah, and it really speaks to her power. I mean, we spoke about the wild hunt in the last episode, or well, the last episode when we were talking about Odin and how it's seen as a bad omen. If you see the wild hunt, your days are pretty much numbered. Well, a lot of people believe that anyway. So the fact that not much is known and not much is written about Hulda, yet she still rides in the Wild Hunt, which again was a select few, shows her authority as a death god. So it makes you think what would be the thought process and the reasoning behind this being the deity that would arrive in a village and either choose to sweep with a rake or a broom. Like it's really interesting.
Yeah, no, definitely. And I like how it um, goes into the fact that she's basically a caregiver of the children's souls after death,
Yeah.
which you were talking about with her caring side, because she chose to be a caregiver of those souls, which shows that she has compassion for not only children but the souls that she takes to her hall.
Yeah.
So to me, it sounds like if you didn't make it to Valhalla, it would be an honor just to be in her hall as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, and that's something that we haven't gotten into a lot is a lot of the different halls, and we will end up getting into that in more detail in the future. But the Norse communities, well, the Norse pagan belief of different halls for not just different ways lives were lived, but how they end is a really interesting concept because it goes beyond, you think of modern afterlife and it's about being reunited, it's about coming together in one place. But the Norse pagan way and a lot of pagan faiths have it sorted out quite differently, really dependent on not just if you were good or bad, but the kind of life you led while you were making those choices. And that's a really interesting level of complexity.
No, definitely, and that's like that's one thing I really like about this book is it touches on so many different aspects on each person, that it really makes you start to think because there's a lot of things that maybe you didn't know, which I think me and
Yeah.
Red have been coming across a lot lately. Is like we knew very little about that person, so then we just learned a lot more that we didn't even know. We just kind of knew like the basic one word answer of what the god stood for a lot of them.
Yeah.
And not necessarily any of their history or how they became to be that or what else they do.
Yeah.
And that's where like I like how it breaks it down because it helps to humanize each and every one of the gods in their own way.
Yeah.
Which brings us to Najord,
Yeah.
which
Njord is a super interesting character. He's a deity I don't know much about. I haven't worked with him a lot. Um, but reading about him, his stories, and so I knew the basics about Njord. I knew he was a god of prosperity. I knew he was of the Vanir, and I knew that he was father to Frey and Freya. But this book got into a really lot of cool detail, even just down to what kind of hall he had, being in a boatyard. And when I got to that part, I instantly had the question, well, if it's a boatyard, what is he the prosperity of? Is it the hunter gatherer fishing kind of prosperity? Is it the raids? Is it conquest? Are they warships? Like it was really interesting, and it goes into a little bit more detail. This states he is seen as the god of prosperity from the shoreline, cargo, trade, raiding. Like it was a general. It was a
right,
non-specific prosperity. You know what I mean?
right, and I love how it goes into he was overseer of not only the seas but motion of the wind and fire, and he was prayed to for success of the full sea ventures, ranging from raiding to fishing. So it wasn't like exclusive. So it was
Yeah.
just praying to him for success in any time you went out on the water for any purpose, basically.
Well, I like that they still made sure to say that he has some control over the tides and the winds. They didn't give him absolute, and you see that a lot in the Norse faith is that nobody is given a lot of absolute authority. It's spread out. There are references to certain of the destructive giants that had control over the tides as well, and we'll learn about that a little bit later on. But it's just an interesting how there seems to be a balance to it. There's no high table. It's something differing, and it's really interesting. Um, You touched when you were talking about Frey um, and the hostage trade. Do you want to kind of go over that a little bit again?
Yeah, I see. So Frey and um, Nord were the ones that were part of the hostage exchange um, during the battle between the Vanir and the Azar. So they were two of the exchanges that happened in order for that peace treaty to come before they came together to fight the gods or to fight the giants because they realized that they had a common enemy. And we had talked about earlier when we were talking in the chapter about the exchange at the very beginning of the chapter that happened that combined these two, and that's why there are some Anir that are on the Veneer side, and some or Asir on the Veneer side, and some Veneer on the Azur side, is because of
Yeah.
those exchanges. So some of the husbands and wives are from one side to the other.
Yeah. Well, and the fact that it is, yeah, I mean, you think of modern, when you think the term hostage in modern thinking, you think somebody capturing somebody to gain something, where this trade kind of existed to keep something after it was decided. It was to keep the peace after they signed their treaties, which is a really interesting way of looking at it. Um, and it makes you kind of think of what the thought process was back then and how we kind of interpret that now. There was another really interesting part where they were kind of talking about when you look back at Njord's name in the traditional and Indo-European um, translations of it, that along with a couple of other terms, the word twins, some people believe, show up a lot, and a lot of people actually believe that Frey and Freya were twins. Now, there's no direct mention of that in any of the lore, and I've never personally seen anything that directly. Have heard people make the claim, but I've never seen anything in any of the scripts that describe that. But again, it's a really interesting theory because we keep coming across this where deities are being compared as being similar or the same, and it
Right.
again leads to the fact that so many things were
Where
different. Yeah,
right where there's a lot of assumptions at times that one and two are of the same when in
yeah,
actuality they aren't, but because of the
yeah,
similarities some people believe they are the same.
yeah.
And then it goes in to talk a little bit about his wife and how they became married, which we'll talk more about when we get to her. So we're just going to kind of skip over that part for now because it does go into some detail on her as well. um, but at that point let's talk about the Locusina. What happened with Locusina with Loki? So um, this is when Loki was gathered in the hall, and Loki had accused Freya of sleeping with all the gods, including her own brother. Um, so Njord comes to his daughter's defense, which says about him that it was to him it was no big deal, really, if a woman wants to have many lovers. It was common back then, especially in certain groups. Along with
Mhm.
it was common, as we've seen with Odin, he had many lovers as well. So I mean, a lot of the gods have many lovers. It's just Loki once again trying to stir the pot. Um, because he came to the honor of his daughter, and it says that most likely, as promiscuous as Loki suggests, but he doesn't care, and some kind of which says that some kind of promiscuity must have been acceptable in the Norse society.
Well, and that's a super interesting point because there's a lot of theory about how the Norse society was built interpersonally and interrelationship wise. There's not a lot of hard facts about that. So many different dramatic Germanic tribes were so different from each other that there's not really a solid answer to that. So the fact that this speaks to a deity on the level of Njord defending that shows it, and the argument could be made as a cultural norm. which is again super interesting.
Yeah, definitely. And then it goes in to talk about, and we're not really going to touch too much on this area, but it talks about the brother and sister aspect and all that. So that's about as much as we're going to mention about that because that is very controversial. Um, but it does say that it may be assumed whoever Frey and Freya's mother was, she may have been Njord's sister.
Yeah,
And then it also goes in to say, but another aspect is the word derives from the masculine form of the female. So, you've got so many different aspects there to play into that, and like I said, the beliefs varied depending on the geological location. So that's where there's a lot of controversy. And we'll see that again and again in the rest of this chapter is the differences that were derived of some god because of the different geological area that it came from at the time, which I found really interesting.
absolutely.
So
So
that
that
takes
lead,
us.
oh, sorry, go
Go
ahead,
ahead.
bud.
I was just gonna say that takes us into another, um,
Yeah.
which I'm gonna let you talk a little bit about that one.
So this is another deity that I wasn't super familiar with, but the story around it is rather interesting, and I actually do want to do a little bit more reading into this because the story is that um, she was brought into a cart carried by cows and taken village to village to village, and when she arrived, everybody would throw down their arms. And I find myself trying to think of to why that is and why in the springtime that was relevant, um, which I still don't have a good answer to. But it leads into another really interesting part is this is the first real point in any of the descriptions of the deities where sacrifices are mentioned. Towards the end of the paragraph, it explains that when she gets back to her island, she's cared to, she's removed from the cart, she's cleaned, she's dressed, and she's put away. And then the thralls or slaves were ceremonially drowned um, in her name, and that's one of the first mentions of any of that kind of activity, and it made me think the fact that the author made such an important point of mentioning that in the descriptions of the deities really makes you wonder how common a practice that really was. I mean, when you see modern entertainment stuff like that, the sacrifices are always front and center, but
Right.
what level did that actually play in the society? And I kind of wonder what your take on that is.
Yeah. See, I found it interesting because that was like her first mention anywhere so far of actual human sacrifice. Um, and I think a lot of people were led to believe that there was a lot more human sacrifice going on than what there was.
Mm,
It was only for specific ceremonies usually, and like this, like it wasn't. It was at the end of the ceremony, after all of her journeys, that the human sacrifice took place. It wasn't like a common practice. It was at the end of her journey.
yeah, and I think it's really important to mention that this specific deity is not mentioned in a lot of our traditional go-to writings. You're not going to find her in the prose or the poetic edda. You're not going to find her in the Havamal. The actual writing of her was done by a Roman in 98 CE, which again kind of leads back, if you're following the timeline, that this specific deity was among the elder of them. So while people were looking at Senna and her cart, that is kind of when this stuff was kind of being looked at. And it again leads back into the sacrifice part and makes you wonder where that began to change in the timeline.
Right, and there's a lot of we got to remember too. There's a lot of gods that we go over in this part of the book. That the reason that they were mentioned was because they're mothers or fathers of some of the minor gods.
Yeah.
Like because she is also the mother of Freya and Freya. So that's why she's mentioned as a god, because if Freya are a god, then their mother obviously was god. Even if there isn't a lot known, they want to make mention to her because we are going over all the gods and goddesses, both the high and the low, through this chapter, which leads us
And
into one of the higher ones now, which is Hemdall.
uh, and what an interesting character he is. Um, Again, he's not another one that I work with a lot. And I've read over this chapter a few times over since I've got the book, and this was the first time where I really sat down and read over each deity, really trying to think of the social aspects of it and how they interact in the society. And Heimdall was super interesting. I mean, we all know the basics. You know, he was stationed as the guard to Asgard. He was supposed to be the one that blows the horn to signal Ragnarok when the giants get to the Bifrost, get to the gates. Um, there's a lot of speculation about, and I found this really interesting that this was a topic of debate, but there was a lot of different thoughts about what the horn would look like. Would it be a brass horn? Would it be a traditional actual horn? And I found it interesting that that was of relevance because to me, I didn't really understand the relevance of it, and I didn't know if maybe you caught something that maybe I missed.
I guess it's more the symbolic reason, and it's like because I think everybody's heard mention of the horn, but you know, um, authors that have gone through to research it and everything have seen that even though there's always mention of it, there's no actual depiction of it or description of the horn. So it kind of leaves it up to the imagination what this horn actually looked like. I mean, me personally, I always expected it to be an actual horn, but a
Yeah,
gigantic one. Off
and
the
it's
biggest ox he could find.
yeah, and it's such a cool top. Like when you really get down and think about it, it becomes really a personal interpretation of what you're picturing. Like when I think of the horn, I think again of a real horn, but it being something that's present, something that's wearable. It's not going to be massive. You know what I mean? And other people picture a giant brass horn attached to the front of Asgard where he stands guard. Like it
See,
seems
and I
silly, but
just
it's super
I just
interesting.
imagine this massive horn hanging on the wall that at that point he just grabs it and starts blowing on
Yeah. No, yeah, and it's a super cool image to think about. Um, they get
it.
deeper
Yeah, but it's
into
cool that right. It's cool that you
the
actually sit and think about though. Whenever you hear the horn mention that he blows, it always gets your
yeah,
mind churning, and your mind always depicts it in a certain way for you.
yeah, absolutely. Um, it leads us into some more interesting, and I actually didn't know this about Heimdall, but it said that he has nine mothers, the daughters of Aegir, and I didn't have a chance to look up Aegir. It's not a term I'm familiar with, so I apologize for that. And it made me think because when everybody thinks about Heimdall, his gifts seem to be a lot more absolute than a lot of the other. Like his dedication is solid. His role is solid. He does not deviate from it. He stands guard. He watches. He listens. And so when they say that he's got nine mothers, it makes you think, okay, well, what traits did he get from each one? What is it that this situation, how did they help him become who he is? I found that interesting, and it's another point that I highlighted in my book that I want to do more research on. They
Right,
get in. Oh, sorry. Go ahead, bud.
right, and like that's what I like is because it not only does it get into the nine mothers, but it also gets into um, how it calls upon the nine waves, and then it also gets into the tree
Yeah,
and everything. And he's got so many aspects about him that just make you wonder, like we were talking about earlier today with him. what exactly he is. Like he's just
Exactly.
he really makes you think, and it's
Yeah.
hard to come up with without doing more research to find out with all these different things that he has, what exactly is he?
Yeah, and we had a really me and Redbeard had a really cool debate on this earlier because as we're going to go into the next part here, the next thing it says is that, and again, a term is going to be said that is not intended to be offensive to anybody. It's in the book, so that's the reason why I'm going to say it. It said he was called muddy backed, which translates into Arglo or Baki, um, mud from the well at the bottom of Yggdrasil. And when I first read that part, I thought because it states that Loki used this as an insult towards Heimdall, and then they really broke it down because the mud that they're talking about is the actual substance that the Norns use to feed Yggdrasil. And this is the first mention of the Norns in this book, and they are a massive, massive, massive point in the culture and the history. The Norns are they're the three fates. They are the ones that can see what has been, what is going to be, and how everybody's fate is going to end. They are that infinite level presence. They're considered on a different level than the actual gods. And when you think about how Odin had to go about his journey and giving his eye to get a taste from that well to gain the wisdom that he did, that he has, he still hasn't, he's seen his fate, but he has no idea when it's going to happen. You know, he still has Heimdall guarding with his horn to signal when it starts because he doesn't know, but they do. And the fact that they now bring his Heimdall and the Norns together is huge because it kind of signals that Heimdall being the muddy backed one meant that he was down there at the roots of Yggdrasil. His back was against the tree, which suggests that he wasn't just the guardian of Asgard, that he might have been the actual guardian of the Tree of Life, which means in turn he's the guardian of the realms that
All the
that
realms.
that make it up, which was really really interesting.
Right, because yeah, in that aspect, it doesn't just make him a guardian of Asgard, but it makes him a guardian of all the nine realms, which is really interesting. And I just love how it just really breaks down Heimdall more than I've ever seen him broken down before going into such detail, because they do go into a lot of detail.
Mm-hmm.
They go into the aspect of he was seen as a king, or his father was seen as a king, and it goes into the three couples that he laid with each of them, and goes into he fathered the enslaved thralls, the freemen, and the ruling class. So not only, but that puts him as help in a creator of the societies as well, which we were talking about earlier today as well.
Yeah, and it leads into the so there's a really cool quote in the book where it said, you know, Odin and his brothers created humanity. They created the beings. But it was Heimdall's actions when he posed as a Rig or king when he went to Midgard that created human society. So because of the people he chose to interact with and the offspring that was brought forward because of that, these people became jarls. They became important people that helped shape the actual intersocial relationships amongst everybody, actual structure of the civilization. And when it gets cut right down to it, that means that Heimdall is the ancestor of the ancestors. And that is massive. Like that is something that could be looked at and thought at and debated and discussed on its own, just those few sentences ongoing. Like it wouldn't stop. It makes you think like the book sorts the gods into the two groups, the Aesir and the Vanir. But Heimdall, though he guards Asgard, seems to be something more than that.
Right.
He stands out, and it's really interesting.
No, I completely agree. And then it goes into a little bit about him and Loki, um, and the aspect between the two of them, which they do end up fighting one another when Ragnarok happens and that cycle begins. Loki and him fight against each other. And then we go into Balder. So Balder was the son of Frigg and Odin, and so that ranks him amongst the gods just by birth, Balder. Now we've spoken of Balder in the past, um, previous chapters a little bit, but this does go into a little bit more detail about it. Um, how when Frigga, we talked about how when Frigga made everything swear to not harm him, and then how Loki intervened when he showed up as an old woman and asked to hear the story. And then when he found out about the mistletoe, he formed the mistletoe dart and he aimed the blind Balder, or and he aimed him at Balder so that Balder would end up dying. And so and then it doesn't talk too much more about Balder besides that aspect, except for the fact that there is two different controversial stories on Balder. Because there's the aspect of that one, but then there's also the aspect of the duel for his wife was the other aspect that it went into, um, and that Balder had died from his wounds, and that Nana, his wife, goes to his opponent instead of him. But then there's not much else that they tell us about him at this point. Now, I
Well,
do believe it gets into him later in the book a little bit more.
there are some really interesting stories about Balder. Like his descriptions, he was supposed to be one of the most beautiful of the gods. He was said to be a striking figure. He was powerful. He was well looked after, and he was important to the Aesir. Um, the story of his trip into Helheim and the fights to get him back out of Helheim and how that goes. We're going to cover that as we go on, and that actually leads us into our next deity, Hel. Hel is a really, really interesting deity. Hel is one of Loki's offspring, but she's set aside, she's set different amongst them. When you look at Loki's offspring, you think of the world serpent, you think of Fenrir, you think of the Gallode, Odin's horse, the eight-legged steed. Though they were all given roles, none were given a realm. Hel was sent to Helheim, which literally translates into the house of Hel. Her house, her what's the word I'm looking? Her hall. Sorry. Um, which is really interesting. The fact that one of Loki's offspring was put in charge of the afterlife, an aspect of the afterlife. Certain, and again, this gets us back to the way you lived your life and how you died actually really mattered because it would depend on where you're going. If you died a life not worth Valhalla or any of those halls, a lot of people believe that Helheim is where you went, and that's really interesting because the fact that they put like the descriptions of Hel are really interesting. That she's um, very black and white. She's half decay, half life. That her still life half looks like the blood has settled in her and she's a corpse. But she's also described as being a really good host to the people that she has. When it gets into Balder dying as a result of the mistletoe needle, it's Helheim where he goes. And there's a lot of talk about, and this is where it gets into Loki again, who's always got his hands into everything. And I'll kick this back over to our Lokian over here to tell us a little bit
Right.
about that part.
Right, because that's where it goes into. So when they were trying to get Balder back, and the condition that was given by Hel to get Balder back was that everyone would have to weep. And then it goes in to talk about the reason that they didn't get him back is because there was one troll that didn't weep, which there is speculation that that troll was Loki in a shapeshifted form in disguise, and he had a hand in keeping him in hell. And
There's
then there's not much else that's told about that aspect of it, besides the fact that that's why he remains still dead in her hall.
yeah,
But it is known to lead the dead and side with the giants at Ragnarok against the gods. So she's known to side with Loki.
and that
Is
is
the
that
speculation.
yeah, that's what's written. There's a lot of really cool document, and hell is one of those figures. I mean, you look at Christianity. What do they call the bad place? They call it hell. The afterlife, the pagan afterlife, is hell. That's how it was transitioned. It was a part of their social control. And it's not in the book, but I'm going to say the story anyway. There's a really cool documentary about Hela and how when the Great Conversion took place, the Christians involved her in the Christian hell. There are writings about how her and Lucifer came to an agreement that she would have a part of the Christian hell and that not even he would go in there. So it shows you the respect and power that this deity had
Right.
amongst the civilization, and not just amongst just the pagans, but the incoming Christians, how vital her role was. And the fact that she was an offspring of Loki is really, really interesting because, again, she's one of those gods that doesn't really belong to the Aesir and doesn't really belong to the Vanir. She stands apart. She doesn't
Yep.
live in Asgard. She has her own realm.
Right,
And it's
exactly.
just
Like, and that's the thing is her realm is totally separate from everybody else.
exactly. And it's not a minor realm. It's the afterlife for like we said when we talk about um, the Norse pagan people back then. Not everybody, like a great many of the people were not warriors. They were farmers. They were regular people. They were people in the community. They were people that were not raiding. They were not traveling. They were not fighting. And the script says that if you didn't die in combat, if you didn't die at sea, or many of the other deaths that would lead you to specific halls, that Helheim is where you would go. And there's a lot of speculation of what that led to. That this book kind of speaks to how she sides um, with Loki against the Aesir during Ragnarok. There's other mentions where when Loki arrives during Ragnarok, it's not with the souls from Helheim; it's with the giants from another realm. It's super interesting when you get down to it how different it really all is.
Right, and that's just right back into the geological differences that they found. How the stories were different in one area than in another. But that'll lead us into Forsyth, um, who landed on an island in Frisia. He then stuck his axe into a stone, and a spring gushed forth from it. He is the son of Balder and Nina, and is considered a settler of lawsuits and other legal entanglements, which makes him a patron god, and is said to give them their laws, which I
Yeah,
think is interesting. So it's like Balder and Nan's son is like in charge of the law aspect of it and making the laws and enforcing the laws. And then it talks about how there was always silence and force with when people would gather by his sacred spring and when drinking from it. So not only but that aspect, but they had enough respect that when they gathered at his well or his spring to drink from it, there was no talk or anything. It was just silent.
Yeah. And
And
that's,
how? Go ahead.
sorry, go ahead, bud.
Oh, and then I was just going to say, and then the other aspect was because of the island that he landed on, none of the beasts on that island could be harmed.
Yeah. Forseti's another one of the ones that like not much is really said about. It doesn't show up a whole lot. I don't really have anything outside of the book that I can add to this particular part.
Right, and
Um,
we're going to be going through some of these gods pretty quick, guys, because there's not much mentioned about it.
yeah,
So we will just kind of read the brief synopsis um, on some of these gods, and then the ones that there's more information on, we'll spend more of the time talking on, which leads us into the next one, which is red.
yeah, it leads us into Aduna, and again, this was a god that we briefly mentioned in the first episode. She's the keeper of the golden apples. And as everybody remembers, the golden apples were what were used to keep the gods young, because the gods aren't infinite. They're not like the, the pseudo Christian gods, where they are expansive and exist in multiple places and do not exist in time. The Norse gods were linear. There was a start, there was a middle, there was an end, and it was these apples that were used to help keep them that way. Um,
Right, and then it goes into talking about Loki again, because even he's got his hand in with Aduna, and it goes into when he insulted the giants, and then he swore to be so he could be released, that he would get her apples out of Asgard in order to free himself. But then when the gods found out what he did, because the gods began to age themselves, they were pretty upset, to say the least. They were a little bit upset at Loki because now they were all aging.
yeah,
So they forced Loki to bring her back, and he did so in the shape of a bird with her held in his mouth as a nut, or in his claws as a nut, which I just it's just typical Loki to bring her back in that kind of way instead of
yeah.
just bringing her back.
The symbolism of it is so cool, because again, it leads it up to so much interpretation. You know what I mean? Like when you think about, and this is going to sound rather silly, but what were the nuts looked at as being? What were their value? Like why a nut? Like it makes you want to know. Like out of all the things in creation, he brought her back as a nut. Why? Like that's just a, and we don't have an answer. I don't have an answer for it. Maybe somebody in here who's going to show up later might have an answer for it. But to me, that just seems really fascinating.
Maybe he thought somebody would get cracked up.
You never know, right? Sometimes you feel like a nut.
And who's that bring us into next?
Braggy, again, is another deity we don't know much about. He is the husband of Udina, the keeper of the golden apples. He is associated with bards, Scots, actually pronounced shop, and equivalently to a skald or wandering performer or poet. So that kind of speaks to what his personality is. Um,
Well, a little
and
bit, but when you look at what Loki has to say about him, though, Loki just called him a bench warmer, because basically during Lokina, um, he was referring to him as a coward,
yeah,
and but then others believe that using the term bench warmers could be a reference to the places of honor that skulls are held when called into the long hall to perform. So, I mean, once again, there's two different interpretations on the same thing, depending
Yeah.
on geological area. Area. But I mean, me personally, I think because of the way Loki was, he meant it the one way, even though it may have really meant another
Yeah. Well, and it leads us into the next part, and this again was something I had no idea about. But there's people that believe that when Odin obtained the mead of poetry, that it was Bragi that gave it to him, which again all of a sudden throws this deity into a major role. He became a part of one of Odin's quests to self better himself. You know what I mean? And that's really cool.
way. And then we go into Gear, which is a giant, uh, and one who is allied with the Azir Vanir, and his hall lies under the sea. He's considered by many to be an embodiment of the deep water and beyond the shoreline and host of the gods, which, that would make him our second ocean god, where the
And
other
how
one,
they divvied it up. We have the
yep,
shoreline and we have the deep waters. It's really interesting.
exactly. And then Loki's brought in to this one as well, when it talks about, uh, during Loki's Cena, Loki commits murder and eventually shatters his relationship with all the gods during this time. And then it goes into talking a little bit more about, the Ajir and how he is known as a brewer, but, um, because of the making of mead, and how he's married to the giantess Ran, which is the next one that we're going to go into, where Ran holds sway over the deep seas as well, and the people that are drowned at sea, she gathers them in her nets and brings them to her golden hall, and they must pay her in gold, but then she keeps them with her.
Yeah.
So that talks about how both of them, their hall is described with glitter and gold between
Yeah.
the two of them, the husband and wife.
Well, again, it leads back into that theory that it wasn't just how you lived and how you, but it was the manner of which you die. If you were a warrior your entire life and you drowned at sea, you were going to the Golden Hall. Like there's no wiggle room about it. It was one of those things where it was very well sorted where you were going to go, and that is really interesting to think what that meant to the society. If you were watching a fleet of raiding ships go out and you never heard from those people again, you didn't know where they were going to end up. Did they make it
Right,
to the shore? Did they end up in a storm? Like what happened?
right. So it's like some of them, because if they died at sea, then they were kept in these halls. But had they made it to their destination and died in a battle, they could be in another hall. So it's like you never, like, there's so many different halls that you could end up in, um, throughout all the different, because each of one of the gods, almost every one of the gods, have their own halls as well. I mean, there are a few that didn't, but a lot of them did. Which leads us into our next god.
Yeah, this list leads us into Scaldi. Scaldi, also the daughter of the giant Theazid. I'm probably not pronouncing that right, and I apologize. Um, she left her home to sought Wirgild, a kind of payment for his murder. So this again, this is a story that most everybody knows, and it's kind of a story about hubris. It's kind of a story about gambling with the fates. But traditionally, if somebody in your family in Old Norse society was murdered by somebody in an unjustified way, you had the right to demand payment from that family. And the same was true for the gods. So when the murder happened, to she went to Asgard, she went to the Assyrian, and she said, "This is what I want," you know. And she had two demands, and the first demand was philosophically interesting. she wanted them to make her laugh because she was so positive that they couldn't because she was in such sorrow. The next part was, again, super interesting, is that her next request was she wanted one of the gods to marry her, and a bargain was struck that one of them would, but they would have to be chosen by just their feet alone. And so she did. Scaldi looked at all the gods just by the feet, and she picked the god with the prettiest feet because she thought it would be Balder. Again, the most beautiful of the gods. And again, that's a term from a lot of the lore. But it was Njord's feet. And so she ended up having to marry Njord. They ended up living, and this is where it gets, again, really, really humanistic. And I'm sure a lot of us can kind of connect with this. First, they moved to Njord's hall, where she can't stand the gulls and the water. So they moved to her hall in the mountains, where now Njord can't stand the silence. And they end up divorcing amicably over irreparable differences.
Right? Like, honestly, I think it was just her way of saying, you know what, I picked the wrong guy's
Yeah,
feet.
yeah, it was just the out, you know. I just don't like seals.
He didn't have webbed toes.
She's connected to the winter months. Again, other than that story, she's not somebody I'm super familiar with. Um, I'm not sure if you picked out anything other than I've kind of briefly gone over so far.
Just kind of how she is said to have married Odin after a divorce with Nador, and even bore him a son, which they say there's not much detail to confirm or deny that myth. Um, but it leads into her having her own cult, and where
Yeah,
she was known and likely worshipped in East Sweden. And then once again, she was the first to tell Loki that he was going to be bound by the gods and the
yeah,
one who places the venomous snake over Loki's face when he is bound by the gods, which leads us into Loki.
that leads us into the man himself.
So, as we know, Loki is a complicated character, and there are many people that are divided over Loki and their opinion of him as a god. There's a lot of people that figure if they leave him alone, he'll leave them alone. And there's others that figure if as long as they give him his due, they'll leave him alone. And then there's others that just work well with him
Yeah.
most of the time. But it goes into how he's a brother to Odin by a blood oath. And he's the father of Sefner, Odin's eight-legged horse. Um, and also the father of Fenrir and the Jagnar and half living, half dead Hell, guardian of the underworld. I mean, he's got all these children that like are all so different in
and,
the
and
aspect of
vital.
creatures.
Yeah,
Um, it's like Loki's the only one of the only gods that bore birth to creatures. Fathered creatures, um, instead of other humanistic type gods or like the other gods for their children.
yeah.
But that goes into Loki being a shapeshifter and how he borrows Freya's cloak to find the location of Thor's hammer because he was always trying to steal Thor's hammer from him just to mess with him because him and Thor used to travel a lot together. But whenever they traveled together, Loki would always cause some kind of menace,
Yeah.
cause something to go wrong, or have some way of messing with Thor the whole time.
Well, and
Just because,
his obsession with the hammer is really cool because I mean we remember talking about Loki's obsession with trying to disrupt the dwarves when they were forging it. and transforming into an insect, and then you know, there's tales that the Mjolnir's hammer or handle was actually supposed to be a lot longer than it was, and it was him interfering with the dwarves that broke the handle, which ended up becoming such an iconic symbol. So you could see how that would kind of get in his head. Now he would become kind of obsessed with like wanting to get it, wanting to mess with it, because he tried to deal with it in the first place and it backfired, and he was never good at dealing with that kind of stuff.
Right, and I think a lot of it just plays into, the fact that Loki's was always seems to be kind of jealous of Thor. So when Thor gets even more power by getting Mjolnir, that's why Loki was trying to put a stop to it, because he's already powerful enough in Loki's eyes, because Loki's always trying to be better than Thor. And it was just another aspect that Loki would have to fight, was that hammer, which is Loki's own fault, because Loki dared them and they made better objects. And he
Mhm.
tried to mess with that one. But then it kind of goes into uh, not only him being a shapeshifter, but then it goes into when he breaks first with the gods in Locusina. And basically, after he commits the murder of the servant, he verbally just starts slandering everybody, and just insulting them in the worst ways possible, because he's basically just like telling them all to F off.
Yeah.
And he's like, you know what, whatever, I'm done with you. Everybody can. And that's basically what he did. And he just went off and just tore everybody down. And as a result of that, uh, that's when they take the intestines of his own son to bind him, and they catch him by putting the snake over his face, which in turn, when he is bound, he has that venom being dripped into his eyes on a constant basis, and his wife stands there with the bowl to catch the venom to prevent the pain that he gets from every time it hits. And it's said to be believed that when she would go to dump the bowl and the venom would hit Loki's eyes, that's what caused the earthquakes.
Yeah.
And so it's just like, and then it goes into, there's some stuff that it goes into, um, that is very debatable, whether or not he broke the chains, at what point he broke the chains, what happened after he broke the chains, or were the chains a representation of the start of the final battle.
Mhm.
Um, which, if that being said, then that goes back into the debate: has Ragnarok happened yet or not? And if it
Mhm.
hasn't happened yet, then wouldn't that mean that Loki's still bound? There's so many different ways to debate that aspect of once he got bound, and whether or not he is still bound, or if he got loose, and you know that's what put him in the determination that when the war started, he was going to lead the giants. So he's been
Yeah.
forming these alliances with the giants the whole time. There's just so many different debates, and then if Ragnarok has already happened, that's a whole nother debate.
Yeah. This book has done a really good job so far in posing some subtly posing some really interesting philosophical questions here. Um, like Randy just said, the last couple of sentences on Loki's paragraph. At the end of days, Loki breaks free from his bonds. He leads the giants in a final battle of Ragnarok, the enemy of the Aesir and Vanir. And we know that Loki, he is Iten. He is a destructive giant himself. That's his background. And that's one thing. But the philosophy about, because the book talked about how the gods are linear. They're in one place at one time. They cannot be in multiple places at one time. And so most of the lore does talk really clearly about Loki being bound until Ragnarok, until the start of Ragnarok. And whether what does that mean to modern heathens? There are a lot of people, including Redbeard here, that work with Loki. There are people here that will claim Loki's presence often. And it makes you it makes you think that, well, if the lore says he's bound, and the lore also says that they're not, that they are linear, what does that suggest in regards to Ragnarok? Has he been bound yet? Has, like, where in this story are we? Has this even
Right.
happened? Is this all prediction? Is the history and legends and the lore that we know all originating from the Norns, the ones that can read the fate, and they're just not telling us what time it happens, when it does happen? Where in the linear time frame are we right now? And you could drive yourself really crazy trying to think about that, because
Definitely.
there is some contradicting information between different sources, and there is also a lot that seems to really support the fact that we're not supposed to know where in this time frame we are, and that's super intriguing to me. There are some
No, I
people that
totally
claim,
agree.
yeah, there's some people that claim we're post Ragnarok after the conversion, and there's other people who are like, no, man, the binding hasn't even happened yet. There's some people that believe that we're in an area between the two where Fenrir is bound because we're here, and what happens with the cave and other very important events like the blowing of the horn to signal Ragnarok and stuff like that. And it's just really, really interesting. Um, the book, the next deity that we cover is Sigmund, and like I said, we just basically went over what's in the book about her. She's Loki's wife, and she's the one that holds the venom bolt over his head. Um, and it was really interesting because they relate that to her. I mean, you have to think about that. If this deity is bound until Ragnarok, his wife is going to sit there holding a bowl over his head the entire time. That really speaks to her character, her compassion, and it instantly makes me think: what is the commonality? What is the bond that brought these two, which just based on their actions are very different individuals from each other,
Right.
together? I don't
Right.
know what you're doing.
Well, and it's funny because this is the only mother of Loki's children
Yeah,
that they refer to as Loki's wife.
yeah,
And this is the only one that, any other time, except in mention briefly before, is mentioned being actually with Loki and involved with, an aspect of what's going on with Loki. And, it just goes to show that, we don't know every side of Loki.
yeah,
It opens up even more doors about trying to figure out Loki himself, because this is the
exactly.
mention of someone that's actually his wife, where that's the only mention of somebody being Loki's wife. And then we go into Manny, which is in culture the brother of the sun goddess. He also drives a cart across the sky, hauling a piece of the moon in it and being chased by a wolf, just like his sister Suna. And there's a lot of correlation with the two being related and how they used to drive their chariots across the sky, and how, as their chariots get captured, is another aspect of a sign of the start of Ragnarok. So we just kind of lumped these guys into two because we
Yeah,
did go over Suna before. So we're going to move on to, and we're just going to kind of go through these last ones pretty quick, you guys, because there's not a lot of mention on them in the next couple pages. So what was the next one, Red?
Astara. So basically, just one mention is that she comes from the east, and Astara does mean east, so her name translates to east in Anglo-Saxon, which again was a specific group of paganistic people. She is associated in modern English, her name kind of associates with Easter, which again is another topic that we could get into a lot of debate about, but we're going to kind of
Right,
push
which
past that.
indicates right, which it just indicates that she is wrapped in with fertility because of the rabbit and the eggs,
Yeah.
and the spring, the time of the year when Easter happens, spring and the fertility. And then we go into
Yes.
Hode, which is part of the two myths of Boulder, the one that um, where Hode is Boulder's brother and was deceived by Loki into shooting the mistletoe dart at Boulder and committing the fratricides, then slain by Val in an act of vengeance. He was also seen as a strong warrior and said that he duels Boulder over Boulder's wife, winning her and slaying Boulder. And even though the outcome of both myths is the same, there's the two separate myths when it comes to Boulder that we talked about before.
Yeah.
And then we go into Hunir, which is one of Odin's brothers and part of the Odin Ludur Hunir trio, which created mankind from driftwood.
And there's two theories behind that. So there's two different trios that are associated. Some believe that it was Odin Hooter, and others believe it was Odin V and Billy. Like there's multiple aspects of the belief just based on the family line. And you're going to come across people that are going to claim that some of these deities are in fact the same deities, just named differently from different regions.
Right, because like even with Ludur, the next one, all it says is he is the third creator, gods Odin, Hunir, and Ludur. That also makes him one of Odin's brothers, and that's all it says about him. And then we go
Yeah.
into V, which refers to a sacred structure where heathens practice their religion and means holiness or sacred. The god V then had a great deal to do with the holy and sacred things and the practicings of those things. And so he is mentioned as one of the three creator gods in the Odin, Vil, and V, where they form source materials. And V is the one who gave La, or commonly Hugh, which they're going to go into in chapter 6. So we'll just leave that part at that because there's going to be more on that then, which
Yeah,
brings us
that needs more
into
discussion.
Vil, which is the other of the two brothers involved in the creation of the humans. And his name means will. And he is the God who gave us the gift of U called spirit or inspiration. So then we'll go over to 53, where we have Jord, one of Odin's lovers and the mother of Thor. So I'll let you go into this one a little bit, Red.
Yeah, so basically what we know about what the book is telling us about these particular next few deities is so short. I'm just going to rapid through it so that we're not skipping over a little detail of somebody we don't know much about.
Right.
Identified as one of Odin's lovers and mother to Thor, Jord represents personified Earth, the planet we stand on, which again kind of would signal why Thor became the guardian of Midgard. She is not to be confused with Midgard. Also, the place we stand on is better to think of her as an embodiment and personification of Earth, the planet, while Midgard is the name of the location. So it's again a really cool aspect of how they sort the stuff out. Where there is the physical planet Earth, there is the embodiment, there is the physical. Where it is in the realm is also relevant because it's interconnected with all the other ones. It's all like it's a spider web and it's complex and it's really interesting. Uller, known as the god of both bow and snowshoe, indicating that his connection to hunting and winter months. His mother Sif, his name means glory. He is also a god called upon prior to Holmgang or dueling, which is an interesting fact about him. We know that his hall is named, I'm going to butcher this, I apologize, you guys, Yadarlo or Yew Dales. Since many bows were made of yew wood, this also indicates his connection to hunting. Because again, as much as we see the bow and arrows in all the TV shows and stuff like that, that was only one side of what was really necessary. That
Right.
achievement, the projectile, was so important to the hunting gathering society and way of life itself, that kind of stuff would be respected and honored as well.
Definitely. And the interesting part that I found was when they started talking about the archaeological digs that happened near the places named, and the unearthing of mainly arm rings, which leads them to believe that he is also connected with the swearing of oaths as well,
Yeah.
which I found really interesting because they found all those arm rings at that site. And then we go into Val, uh, who is the son of Odin and Rhine, and he basically um, his name breaks down to a good shot, and it's because of his ability as an archer. He's said to survive Ragnarok and dwell in Vidar, but also that his main purpose was the slaying of Hood and avenging Boulder's death, and that's really what his main goal was, what he was focused on. And then you got Vidar, who is the son of Odin and Gerd, which referred to as a silent god, most clearly associated with avenging his father's death because he rips Fenrir's jaw apart and kills the wolf. And then folklore also believes that the remnants of shoe leather were offered to him in order to help strengthen the soles for when he stepped on the wolf's jaw to rip it apart.
Yeah.
And that basically, you guys, wraps up chapter 3 of A Practical Heathen's Guide to the Astra by Patricia Lafayllve. This was a really good chapter, you guys, and we are going to be getting into next week, chapter 4, the ancestry and worship in heathenry. So I'm excited for that chapter. Um, we will be going over that on Wednesday at 9 p.m. Central here. And then on Friday, we're going to do the end of the chapter, which is connecting with the ancestry, and just go over a couple of the ancestral blot and the ancestor meditation and just discuss those. And then we want to open up the guest boxes at that time for people to just come in and talk about both chapter 3 and 4 and anything else that they found interesting in the book so far. So that'll be our Friday episode at 9 p.m., you guys. But this has been an amazing chapter. We're going to be heading into the Q&A section after we get done here today. And I'm going to let Red wrap it up with anything else he would like to say about this chapter before we sign off for the night.
It's this is amongst one of the best chapters in the book, just because of the thought that if you read it once, go and you've just heard what we've talked about again. If you read it again, you're gonna pick up on even more stuff. Like, I didn't make the connection until Randy said it tonight about um, Easter and the rabbits, because you think in modern times now, and you'll hear a lot of, especially evangelicals, say this. You know, the bunnies and the eggs have nothing to do with Easter. This is about this. This is about this. And then all of a sudden, once again, we are finding another connection that makes them relevant. So,
Exactly. And that's what I love about the learning aspect in this
yeah,
book.
imagine
All right,
what we're
guys.
going to learn tomorrow.
Right? Imagine what. Wait till we hit Wednesday and we get
Yeah.
into that chapter, you guys. And so many more after this. There's so much good information in this book. But as always, you guys, this is a we thing, not a me thing, not a him thing. We can't do this without each and every one of you. Please don't forget to jump on to our bios and hit those beacon pages. Follow our Instas. Get on that Discord with us. And don't forget to help us out in those 3 support pages at the top, you guys. As always, stay amazing, creating, and be awesome. And we will see you guys on Wednesday.